Good afternoon. I'm Rev Dave Thompson, and I'm excited to welcome you back to our Civil Human Bible study today. It's Tuesday. We had our Memorial Day weekend. I hope you all had a good weekend. I certainly did. Today, I'd like to talk about a conversation that's fairly difficult, and that's because it has a lot of emotional baggage with it. It comes with a lot of the gray areas in life that we don't necessarily like to have to deal with in our lives. The conversation that I want to start a small series on is about marriage and divorce. First, I want to introduce myself to say that I'm a civil human minister. And so what that means is that I focus my ministry on building human peace and common ground. So in that effort, I'm attempting to look at my own spiritual heritage and my own spiritual scriptures to try to find those teachings that I feel are applicable across the board to all humans, regardless of our faith or our politics or our lifestyles, which all differ and we all need to be able to have our own opinions on. Today, I'm actually sort of excited to bring this conversation to you. It can be dicey, it can be challenging, and a lot of us have divorce and remarriage, or we're touched by it in some way. Most of us, in fact, are. And so today I want to start by talking about the beginning. Because in this passage, you're going to see the Pharisees, who are the religious leaders of Jesus' day, who have come to Jesus to try to catch him or test him once again. And they're going to ask him about divorce and remarriage. Jesus is going to respond talking about the beginning of why God created man and woman and what the purpose was. And it's very important to understand the context of all this. And so I really want to spend some time talking about the early context of creation in the Genesis, Adam and Eve story that many are familiar with, and talk about what Jesus is bringing from that. So let's go ahead and jump into the text. It's Matthew chapter 19, starting with verse 1 through 10. Starting with verse 1. Now it came to pass, when Jesus had finished these sayings, that he departed from Galilee and came to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And great multitudes followed him, and he healed them there. The Pharisees also came to him, testing and saying to him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?" And he, meaning Jesus, answered and said to them, "Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate.'" Then he said to them, the Pharisees, they said to him, "Why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away?" He said to them, "Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery." And the disciples say to him, "If such is the case of the man with his wife, it's better not to marry." So there's a lot to unravel there. I want to walk through this carefully because I think that there is a significant misunderstanding in many ways about what the intention of marriage is in the creation story. And more than that, what Jesus was talking about when he says words like sexual immorality and committing adultery. Those words are actually fairly specific in the Greek, and understanding them is going to provide a lot of clarity to what Jesus is referring to and why it has to do and ties back to the beginning of it all. So today I want to talk about the beginning. Many of us are familiar, those especially who come from maybe a Western civilization, are familiar with the story of Adam and Eve. And I'm just going to recite a little bit of it so that I'm not going to go read it, but I know very well, since I spent 20 years talking about this very thing with ministers. In the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth. And what's interesting is that God's hovering over the earth, which is void, and he decides to populate it with stuff. And then, he creates the simpler things and more complex things and more complex things and more complex things, fish, birds, mammals. And then at the very top of it, he creates man, Adam. And this word really is best translated human in our day and age. It's very much, a lot of this language you're going to hear today and in these next couple of series, there's a lot of he and his, and a referral to women as being the wife, as opposed to her being an equal partner in the divorce process. There's an important understanding of culture here that is important to know, because once we understand that, then we'll realize what the implications are. So, God creates Adam, who's evidently a genderless creature. And the first problem that God recognizes, and this is often overlooked in especially many modern Christian theologies and expressions of the church, the first thing that God does is recognizes a moral problem, something that is not right, it's not good. And so God says, it's not good that man, this creature I've created, is alone. And so God separates the two. Actually, he first goes through all of the creation of the earth and, says, hey, see if you can find an animal or something that you can hang out with. No doubt he probably ended on dogs because they're amazing pets, but it wasn't suffice, and he was still alone. And God, the creator, seems to recognize that he's alone, that he needs companionship. That's going to be very, very key moving forward in our conversation, but also in the understanding of the nature of relationships. So God creates, he splits the genders in two, and we're given Adam and Eve. And as you know, Eve ends up biting the apple, gives it to Adam. Well, it's not an apple, it's the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, and which are not supposed to eat from, and then they break the first law. And that's, a whole other conversation. What I want to focus on is the very important moral rule and the first real commandment that we're given. We have the 10 commandments, these sort of rules of life, morality, of what we should do in life to be good people. This was actually one of the first. And many people don't consider it such, but I think it's imperative that we consider this a substantial, fundamental rule about us as humans. That we should not be alone. That we need relationship, and not just relationship, we need intimacy. Intimacy is a fundamental human need. Every person on this planet has that. Unless, there are a small percentage of people who are able to be on their own. And Jesus actually talks about those in just a few verses. You may have heard a little bit about it, but he's going to talk more about eunuchs, and we'll get into that in a couple of days. But the whole point is this: being alone is not good. Now, the reason that I bring this up is fairly simple. When people look oftentimes at the beginning and they say, in the beginning, and they quote Jesus, it says, God creates them male and female, and for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be married to the woman, and the two shall become one flesh. And really the word here in the Greek is that the two things fall into each other or settle into just one entity. It says one flesh. It's the physical aspect of our body. That's what that word sarx means in this Greek. But the verbiage here has this notion of them coming into a completion of one unified person. And that is having a relationship together and having intimacy together. A lot of times people come back to the beginning and they say, well, God created man and woman and so that they should be married, and that's it. That's the first rule of scriptures. Go and multiply, as God says after that. But they neglect the most important part of that this was a solution by God to provide man with relationships. Now, whether you want to approach this as a literal historic record, as in a scientific record, and that it was 24 hours of 7 days, and so in 1 week that God creates everything from nothing, it's certainly your prerogative. Where I come from is to be actually, as in my esteem, to be as conservative with the text as possible. And by that I mean sticking with the actual meaning of the original writers as much as possible. And then those writers, when they recorded this, if you want to consider it a story or a fable or a moral lesson, that's also fine too. In the end, the point is what the intention was, not where we came from. It's not the point of Genesis. They're not trying to specify the exact scientific formula for evolution or for development. There's plenty of room to embrace evolution within this creative story, and I will get to that at some point. Not now, but it's really important to address that issue at some point. Staying on message here, I do have a tendency to go off on rabbit trails. So, Michael, I'm coming back to the center here. What's the whole point here? Why does Jesus bring this up back in our text, and how in the world does this apply to us 2,000 years removed? In this culture, marriage is not a sacrament per se. There's no thing that is ritual that has to be done for people to be married in any of the scriptures, but it's developed a cultural aspect of marrying people together. And now the question is, what do you do when it's not working out? When you have two couples who were brought together in order to be one person, how do you divide those? And can you divide those? And if you divide them, are there certain circumstances that are more important to do that with? And do we encourage couples, especially those of us who come from either mentor or ministry or counseling? What do we say to people who want to get a divorce or who have had a divorce? The first primary rule is this: it is not good for us to be alone. And if I may, when we talk about LGBT issues and individuals who do not have a traditional, perhaps heterosexual marriage or coupling, the way that I have come from it, and those of you, if you want to read my book over coffee, I walk through this more substantially. But the intention of God is to create relationship, to remove loneliness, because as we know, loneliness can be used to punish people. It's one of the most extreme punishments that we inflict on individuals in our jail systems. We put them in isolation. That is one of the most extreme punishments. Why? Because we are not meant to be alone. And what do we do in a marriage, though, when we're still alone? When an individual no longer participates or is unwilling to, when they perhaps do things that are damaging to us, either physically or emotionally, what do we do in those situations? Is the two becoming one flesh happening in that marriage? Is there relationship? Is there purpose? And is there a focus for them to continue helping each other out? Just like I need my right hand to do something beneficial to my left hand because we are the same body. So we're trying to go in the same direction. So everybody's got to work together. This is really going to be important. It's tomorrow and maybe the day after as well. I haven't quite decided. We'll talk about actually divorce a little bit, because I think that is going to help us understand why Jesus then talks about sexual immorality as being a grounds for divorce, and why adultery continues from that point for those who are sent away. I'm reserving myself to talk about divorce at all. I really want to, because here's the thing. This passage is so often misunderstood, so often taken out of context. Had people realized what was going on back then when people were getting divorced, what the situation was, and what happened especially to women who were being sent out, away. They were being cast away. The word means to set free or to release, similar to the concept of forgiveness, but quite the opposite, right? So it's basically sending the wife away on her own. And in that society, in that ancient culture, that is near survival mode for her, as it would be even in our modern culture, but even more so back then. So divorce was really an affront to the woman and to those who were being sent away. And that's going to be where I'll talk about tomorrow. But for today, I want to point out that Jesus' intention isn't specifying that marriage is only between a man and a woman by stating that God creates man and woman. Is he saying that that's what is said in the beginning? Is it saying that that's going to be the greater majority of people in our society that do function in that well? Yes, I absolutely think so. That's just the way. It's biologically, we do have complementary heterosexual organs, but we also are trying to solve the fundamental problem, and that is being alone. And if we cannot be in a traditional heterosexual relationship, we still need to be alone. It is not good, to quote God, it is not good for us to be alone. And I've seen many people attempt to try to be alone because society forces them to. Because society, especially religious cultures and societies, misinterpret the early text and often the words of others to suggest that they have to be alone because of their situation. No, because that creates destruction. It did in my life, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about eunuchs and celibacy, because Jesus ties that in at the end here. But that's going to be a whole other day a whole other study and conversation. But in my own life, having been a minister, having studied and done everything possible as a fundamentalist, evangelical Christian to be as pure as possible, it destroyed my life to force myself into isolation because I am not gifted in that. We'll get there a little later. I just wanted to give you a taste. I appreciate you joining me today. This is going to be a bit of a touchy conversation, and I really would appreciate your reflections and comments in the comments below this video. It's important for me to hear from you the things that are working for you, that make sense to you, and the things that aren't, so that I can clarify and bring some more and to alleviate confusion. The last thing that I want to say in this before I let you go and we go our separate ways, one of the fundamental things, it's part of my civil human structure and etiquette for building peace and common ground. Civil and human each are 5 letters each, represent 5 rules each. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but the one thing that I do want to hit is in the civil aspect of it. These are the rules that I feel represent the needs, the shared human needs that we all have. The first one being that we all need to believe what we need to about our faith. The second, we need to be independent from the control of others. The third, we need to vote for those who will have control over us. And then intimacy. We must be able to intimately love the person of our own choosing, because to not creates destruction and depression and all kinds of chaos in people's lives. And we have got myriads of examples of that being the case. The last one, of course, being we should be able to live our lifestyle the way we want to be happy. Thank you for joining me again today. This is, I say a fun study in the sense that it's one of great interest and one of that has a lot of implications for many of us and many of our loved ones. And I want to provide some clarity in this series. And I would encourage you, if you do have other people who are asking about this, divorce and remarriage, to encourage them to view this study, because these things that I'm talking about are really going to help them process what's going on and give them some ability to let go of a lot of the guilt and baggage maybe that they've come along with as a result of the way our church has responded to divorce and remarriage. So until tomorrow, when we start talking about divorce, I want to say to you that I love you. And I hope you choose to love yourself. It's the only love in this world that we have any control over. And now I invite you to join me as we go about the rest of our day, loving our neighbors the same way. Thank you.